Blue Lake was known for its beauty and mystery, a secluded gem hidden deep in the woods. Fishermen would often return with stories of massive, record-breaking fish, making it a legend among outdoor enthusiasts. But locals knew better. They knew of the whispered tales of strange occurrences, stories of people who ventured out on its waters only to vanish without a trace. Boats found adrift with poles still cast, tackle boxes left open, and nets abandoned, as if the fishermen had been plucked out of existence. It was a rumor for years, a quiet ghost story that locals exchanged over beers, but nothing concrete enough to ward away the brave. That was until the disappearances became more frequent. When hikers and fishermen started going missing at an alarming rate, fear began to seep through the town. People blamed wildlife, chalked it up to freak accidents, and swore off the lake. But Blue Lake's charm called some back, and despite the growing unease, Camp Blue Lake, a rustic retreat nestled by the lake's edge, stayed open. The owner was desperate, offering steep discounts to lure campers, assuring them that the rumors were just that, rumors. But the bargain was a sinister one that left campers lured by low prices and lakefront views, unaware of what was hiding beneath the surface. One misty evening, as the last of the campers settled around the fire pit, strange ripples began to disturb the lake's glassy surface. No one noticed at first, too busy laughing, toasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories. But when a fisherman from across the lake let out a scream, a long, piercing cry that tore through the night, the campers went silent, staring at each other in terrified confusion. A few campers, out of curiosity or perhaps bravery, grabbed flashlights and headed toward the dock. There, barely visible through the fog, a boat drifted aimlessly, its only passenger missing. Then, just beneath the water's surface, they saw it, a shadow so massive that it took a moment to realize it was moving. Something huge, with glistening scales that reflected their flashlight beams, slid beneath the boat and disappeared into the murky depths. They watched in horror, frozen to the spot, when another scream erupted from the far end of the camp. A young couple had wandered too close to the shore, trying to get a better view of the creature, only for something to explode from the water, a grotesque scaled monster with webbed claws, eyes like black pits, and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It seized one of them, dragging him under in one brutal motion, leaving the water stained red. Panic broke out as campers scrambled to flee. The creature was relentless, hunting anyone who strayed too close to the water, its slick, slimy form gliding silently through the shallows, waiting for the next victim. Those who tried to hide in their tents were not spared. The monster's strength was terrifying, tearing through fabric and canvas as if it were paper, dragging screaming campers down toward the lake. Soon, only a handful remained. The survivors, huddled together and traumatized, decided to make a run for it as dawn approached. They followed the main path out of camp, but every time they reached what should have been the edge of the lake, they found themselves looping back to their original spot as if the forest itself were trapping them. Exhausted, they collapsed at the campsite, and for the first time, they noticed the symbols etched into the trees, a circle with a slash through it, repeated over and over around the perimeter of the camp. They pieced together that the camp had been some sort of offering ground. The lake creature was ancient, perhaps older than the forest, bound to the lake by some ritual involving these markings. The camp's owner must have known all along, using his guests as bait, sacrificing their lives to the monster to keep it satisfied. Desperate, the remaining campers confronted the camp owner when he finally showed up at sunrise. The man looked tired, worn down, as if carrying a lifetime of guilt. He confessed in hushed, shaking tones, "It can't leave the lake as long as it feeds on those who come close." When they demanded to know why he hadn't warned them, he simply muttered, "Because I can't leave either. We're all bound to it now." That day, as the few survivors staggered away from the camp, they left with one warning: stay away from Blue Lake. But for some reason, they all found themselves back there within days, drawn by an insatiable pull they couldn't explain. And when they did, they saw fresh etchings on the trees, new symbols, forming a wider boundary. The lake had grown hungrier. The ancient monster would wait no longer. As they disappeared beneath the still waters, all that was left were a few dark ripples before the lake's surface smoothed over once again, hiding the horror that lay beneath. The luxury cruise liner Eternal Horizon set sail on a calm, starry night, gliding smoothly over the inky black waters of the open ocean. It was the vacation of a lifetime, a week-long trip filled with fine dining, live entertainment, and the allure of warm, tropical destinations. Guests were carefree, lounging on the sunlit decks during the day, enjoying cocktails under the stars at night, and dancing to live bands. They were miles away from the stresses of daily life, floating in a perfect bubble of paradise. But things began to change after the first few nights. It started subtly. A woman named Rita vanished from the lower deck late one evening, her deck chair left empty, a drink spilled onto the wood. Some of her friends assumed she'd gone to bed early, and no one noticed her absence until the following morning. Her husband reported her missing, but the crew chalked it up to a possible late-night swim gone wrong, despite safety measures discouraging swimming after dark. On the third night, a young couple disappeared from the poolside. Their towels and beach bags remained on their lounge chairs, but they were nowhere to be found. Some of the other passengers whispered nervously, glancing at the dark water below, but rumors spread that they'd eloped or had gone back to their cabin. The cruise director assured everyone that it was just a coincidence, a mysterious romance. The party continued, but by the fourth night, everyone was on edge. As darkness fell, more people went missing. A group of college friends who had been celebrating graduation were last seen near the rear railing, and an elderly man who had been photographing the stars vanished from the top deck. Panic began to ripple through the ship, with passengers reporting strange sounds, scraping against the hull, low moans that rose with the ocean breeze, and what sounded like claws scratching across metal. The rumors spread like wildfire. Something was lurking in the water. By the fifth night, the ship's atmosphere had turned tense, guests' laughter replaced with murmurs of fear. The crew remained tight-lipped, issuing only vague assurances, but their strained faces revealed their worry. The captain announced that they were heading back to port early, due to mechanical issues. However, whispers circulated among the passengers that the crew had found deep gouges and strange marks along the ship's hull, as if something massive had been clawing at it from beneath. Then the storm hit. Thunder rumbled ominously, and a heavy rain began to fall, soaking the decks and causing waves to batter the ship. Lightning illuminated the churning ocean, and the cruise liner rocked violently as the storm's fury grew. The passengers gathered in the dining hall, clutching each other and bracing against the storm, hoping to ride it out safely. But then, in a flash of lightning, they saw it. A massive shadow rose from the water, looming over the ship. It had enormous, slick tentacles that wrapped around the side of the vessel, each as thick as an oak tree, with suckers as large as portholes. In the brief seconds of illumination, they caught glimpses of glistening scales, jagged, barnacle-covered claws, and rows of sharp teeth that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The creature's eyes, glowing like molten lava, locked onto the horrified faces staring back at it. Screams erupted as the monster's tentacles lashed out, curling around passengers and dragging them overboard with terrifying speed. People tried to flee, but there was nowhere to hide. The beast seemed to have a purpose, targeting those closest to the railings and pulling them into the depths below with unimaginable strength. The ship's emergency alarms blared, and the crew scrambled to evacuate passengers into lifeboats. But the waves tossed the smaller vessels like toys. The beast swatted some of them aside, sinking the lifeboats before they even hit the water. A few brave souls tried to fight back. Some threw chairs, bottles, anything they could find. But the monster's hide was impenetrable, its size far beyond anything they could harm. Its tentacles continued to probe the decks, curling around fleeing passengers, lifting them into the stormy air, and then plunging them into the raging sea. The night was filled with terror, thunder, and the monstrous roars that echoed for miles. The ship's lights flickered as the creature's final attack hit the hull, cracking the metal and sending shudders through the entire vessel. The captain, desperate, made one last attempt to save the remaining passengers, steering the ship straight into the waves to create distance from the creature. But the monster was relentless, following close behind, keeping pace no matter how fast the captain tried to push the failing engines. In one final devastating blow, the creature's massive body slammed into the eternal horizon, tipping it almost entirely on its side. People screamed as they slid across the decks, clinging to railings and each other. But it was no use. The monster's tentacles wrapped around the ship, crushing it with unimaginable force. The ship's last lights went out, swallowed by the black ocean and the relentless storm. When dawn broke the next morning, there was nothing left of the eternal horizon. The ocean was calm again, as if the horror of the previous night had never occurred. The only sign that anything had happened was a single lifebuoy floating on the water, with the ship's name barely visible beneath scratches and claw marks. It was supposed to be a quick detour. 3 friends, Lena, Marcus, and Ben, had been on a road trip across the countryside, driving through small towns and taking pictures of odd roadside attractions. They'd been laughing, sharing stories, and planning their next stops. But late one evening, somewhere between nowhere and where are we, their car suddenly sputtered and stopped. Marcus tried to turn the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. With night closing in and no cell service, they reluctantly decided to walk to the only place they could see in the distance, a small, dimly lit building with a flickering neon sign reading, Shoreville Wax Museum. Lena raised an eyebrow. Seriously? A wax museum? We don't have a choice, Ben replied with a shrug. Maybe they'll have a phone or something. The trio made their way to the entrance, which was surprisingly unlocked. The smell of old wax and dust hit them as they stepped inside. It was eerily quiet, with dim lights casting long shadows over the figures lined up against the walls. Famous faces stared blankly back at them from every corner. Presidents, actors, musicians, even historical figures dressed in elaborate costumes. But there was something unsettling about the place. The faces of the wax figures seemed almost too realistic, their eyes a little too bright, their skin a little too lifelike. They approached the front desk, but no one was there. "Hello?" Lena called out, her voice echoing through the silent halls. No answer. "Let's just look around and see if there's a phone or something," Marcus suggested. They walked deeper into the museum, passing through narrow hallways lined with wax figures. Each exhibit was more unnerving than the last. There was a section with wax soldiers, posed in battle, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. Another room featured a lineup of famous musicians, each holding an instrument as if caught mid-performance. And then, toward the back, they entered a horror-themed room, filled with figures of monsters, killers, and ghouls. Ben shivered. This place is seriously creepy. Suddenly they heard a soft creak from somewhere behind them. The 3 spun around, but no one was there. The silence settled again, heavy and oppressive. "Let's get out of here," Lena whispered. But when they turned back toward the entrance, the hallway stretched on far longer than they remembered. The exhibits seemed to have shifted slightly, and the lights grew dimmer. Panic rose in Lena's chest. "This hallway wasn't here before. We didn't walk this far, did we?" "No, we didn't," Marcus replied, his face pale. Just then Ben froze, staring at something behind them. Lena and Marcus turned to look, and their hearts nearly stopped. One of the wax figures, a tall man in a dark suit with a gaunt face and piercing eyes, was now standing a few feet closer than before, "Wasn't he back by the door?" Lena stammered. "Maybe we're imagining things," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. But as they started to move forward, they heard footsteps echoing softly down the hall, getting louder. The figures around them seemed to shift subtly, some leaning closer, others turning their heads just slightly, their glassy eyes following the friends. With a surge of adrenaline, they ran, turning corners and sprinting through hallways. But every turn seemed to bring them back to more wax figures, each one posed as if waiting. And each time they looked, the figures seemed to be in different positions, closer, with expressions that seemed almost alive. They reached a dead end, a darkened room filled with wax figures dressed as Victorian-era townspeople. Their expressions were solemn, their eyes fixed on the trio. Ben moved forward, desperately searching for an exit, when he froze. The figure directly in front of him blinked. Lena screamed, and they turned to run, but the Victorian figures were already moving, their stiff limbs jerking as they shuffled forward. The friends bolted through a side door, only to find themselves in another room, filled with wax figures of executioners, each holding a weapon, their heads turning to watch as the friends passed. "This can't be happening," Marcus muttered, his voice barely audible. They were trapped. No matter where they ran, they ended up in another room full of wax figures, each time with the figures inching closer, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. It was as if the museum itself were alive, shifting its halls to keep them inside. Finally, they ended up back in the main hall. The wax figures lined both sides of the room, creating a narrow path to the exit. The door was just a few yards away. "Go! Go!" Marcus shouted, leading the charge. But as they sprinted toward the exit, the wax figures sprang to life, reaching out with hands that felt too warm, too human. They grabbed at the friends, pulling them back, their faces grinning horribly as they dragged the trio deeper into the museum. The next morning, a maintenance worker arrived to find the museum empty. He noticed 3 new figures standing in the main hall. 2 young men and a woman, frozen in expressions of terror. Their waxy faces looked too lifelike, as if they were silently screaming for help. The worker shrugged, used to the eccentricities of the museum's ever-growing collection, and continued with his rounds, oblivious to the new additions that now stared blankly from their places in the hall, forever trapped in the haunted walls of the Shoreville Wax Museum.